Hi there, my name is Yasmin. I am a tutor here at Tutor Impact, and today we are going to be discussing all about diffusion. Now, the first question you might have is what actually is diffusion? Particularly if you haven't heard about it before, you probably don't know what it means. So the generally accepted definition of diffusion, as you can see on the screen, is the spreading out of particles of any substance in a solution or particles of a gas, resulting in a net movement from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And the key part here is moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So it's basically just the movement of substances from an area where they're really concentrated to where they're more spread out. And when many particles are close together, they collide with each other more. So when these particles are much closer together, they collide with each other more and more often, which results in them moving around and becoming more mixed with other particles in the area. And this is a passive process because no energy is required. So it's a passive process because no energy is required. Now we're going to then move on to look at diffusion and cells. So some substances can move over the cell membrane via diffusion. And if you don't know what the cell membrane is, then I'd really recommend you watching the cells video, which has been made by another one of our tutors here, as it will give you a brief introduction about cells and the structures that are found in cells. But as I said, substances can move over the cell membranes via diffusion. And this allows substances to pass into and out of cells. So substances can go through and out of this cell membrane. But in order for this to be able to happen, the molecules that are passing over this surface have to be small enough to get through the sort of gaps in the surface. For example, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and water can all pass across a cell membrane. However, larger molecules such as starch and proteins cannot. So oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and water, because they're much smaller, they can pass across this cell membrane via diffusion. However, the bigger molecules such as starch and proteins cannot. You might be wondering where this takes place, and we're going to discuss two brief examples of diffusion. The first example is diffusion in the lungs. And you can see here on this diagram on the right, we have an alveolus. So the lung is filled with loads of these little sacs called alveoli, and we're looking at just one of these here. And this is a really good example of diffusion taking place in the body. So oxygen moves through the membranes of the structures called alveoli. So it moves through this cell membrane, this wall here, and then it moves into the red blood cells, which are in this blood capillary. So the oxygen moves from the alveolus here, and it moves through the cell membranes into the blood capillary and into that red blood cell. And it can then be carried to cells across the body for respiration. Similarly, carbon dioxide, which is up here, that can similarly move from the red blood cells into the lungs to be exhaled, because this is a waste product of respiration. The body doesn't need it. So to get rid of it, it can go from these red blood cells and it can diffuse across the cell membrane into the alveoli, and it can then be breathed out. It can be exhaled. And these movements of gases, this is called gas exchange, and it's facilitated by the process of diffusion. So we have, as we said before, we have the oxygen diffusing across into the red blood cells from the alveolus, and we have the opposite with the carbon dioxide as it diffuses out of the red blood cells and through the cell membrane into the alveoli. So this is an example of diffusion. Similarly, we have urea. So urea is another waste product, and this also diffuses from the liver cells into the blood plasma via diffusion. And from there, it's then carried to the kidney to be excreted. So urea, we have to get rid of it because it's a waste product. It moves from the liver cells in your liver, and then it moves into the blood plasma where it's carried to the kidney for excretion. And again, diffusion just facilitates these processes, facilitates the movement from the liver cells to the blood plasma, and then eventually from the blood plasma to the kidney. So diffusion helps facilitate all of these really important processes in the body. So next we're going to look at the factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So there are three main factors when it comes to diffusion. The first one is the concentration gradient. So the greater the difference in concentration between two areas, the faster the rate of diffusion. So if, for example, taking the lung example before, if there's loads of oxygen in that alveoli, it will, and there's no oxygen in the red blood cell, this is a steep concentration gradient because there is a very low concentration in the red blood cell and there's a very high concentration gradient in that in the alveoli. So this means that there will be a faster rate of diffusion across that cell membrane as the oxygen moves into the red blood cell. And the reason for this is the fact that the particles in that alveoli, using the example before, they're randomly moving down the gradient. Randomly moving down this gradient, and they're not moving against it. And there's obviously quite a lot more concentration in the top bit. And then the next factor we'll be looking at is temperature. And the greater the temperature, the greater the movement of particles. So this results in more collisions and therefore a faster rate of diffusion. So as I said before, the temperature, if it's higher, there is more particles moving around because they have more energy. This results in more collisions between particles, and therefore there is a faster rate of diffusion. So the greater the temperature, the higher the rate of diffusion. Now, the last one we're going to be looking at here, which is the third factor here, is the surface area of the membrane. And the greater the surface area of the membrane, the more space there is for particles to move through. So there is a faster rate of diffusion. So if you have a longer cell membrane, there is more space for the particles to move through that membrane. And so there is a greater rate of diffusion. So just quickly recapping, the greater the difference in concentration, the faster the rate of diffusion. The greater the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion, and the greater the surface area, the faster rate of diffusion. So when all of these factors are increased, they're greater, there is more diffusion taking place for the reasons I've explained before. We're going to now look at surface area to volume ratio. So we spoke just then about the surface area, and an important calculation to be done is the surface area to volume ratio. And this is the size of the surface of the organism compared to its volume. So it's the size of the surface, so the outside, compared to the inside, which is the volume of the surface. If this is large, the organism is less likely to require specialised exchange surfaces and a transport system because the rate of diffusion will be sufficient in supplying and removing the necessary gases. This links back to what we were just talking about with surface area. Where the surface area is greater, there is more space for those particles to move through. So as I said, if the surface area to volume ratio is greater, then there is less need for sort of specialised exchange surfaces and transport systems because that rate of diffusion will already be sufficient. Now, to calculate the surface area to volume ratio of a particular object, you need to look at this formula below. So you need to work out the volume firstly, and you also need to work out the surface area. To work out the volume, as you can see below, this is the length times the width times the height of a particular object. And the surface area, which is the other figure you need to do this ratio calculation, you just need the length times the width. So it's just those first two components of the volume. And this is how you calculate the surface volume to to volume ratio. You work out these two figures and then you simplify it down to the sort of lowest numbers you can do. So we're going to go through a worked example of this next. So what I would like you to do is, thinking of look at the formulas we just looked at, I want you to work out the surface area to volume ratio of this cube. Now, I'm going to just give you a couple of minutes to figure this out. And what I want you to do is just pause this video and take a couple of minutes, as I said, to try and work out what the answer is. I'll quickly go back and let you know that the volume is the length times the width times the height, and the surface area is the length times the width. And what you then need to do is simplify that ratio down into the lowest denominators of those figures. So pause the video now and have a go, and I will go through the answer afterwards. So if you don't get it, don't worry, we will be going through it. So just pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so I'm hoping you've now worked out what the ratio is for this cube. Don't worry if you didn't manage to do it, because we're now just going to quickly look at how you work out the calculation. So we've got this formula again. We have the volume, which is the length times the width times the height, and we have the surface area, which is the length times the width. And you make this into a ratio. So starting with the volume, I'm going to get my calculator out so I can do this with you. So I have a blank calculator here. The first step is to work out the volume. So we need, for this calculation, we need the length times the width times the height. So we need the length times the width times the height. And we have all three of these figures in the diagram here. So we need to work out 3 times 3 times 3. So if you can't do this in your head, you can use the calculator. So it's 3 times 3 times 3. And this figure is 27. So 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. So we've worked out the volume of this cube. And then for the surface area, again, we just need to work out the length times the width. So the length times the width. And here we can see again, it's 3 times 3. If you can't do this in your head, the answer is 9, but we'll just quickly do this on the calculator. So 3 times 3 is 9. So we have 27 and we have 9. So we put that first as the ratio, so 27 to 9. However, we can simplify this down to make it easier to read. So what you need to do is think of the number that both of them can be divided by. You can probably look up a video on calculating ratios if you don't know how to do this already. But I simplified this down to 3 and 1. I did this by dividing both sides by 9. So we did 27 divided by 9, which is 3, and obviously 9 divided by 9 is 1. So this gave us the ratio of 3 to 1 for this cube. So the ratio for this cube is 3 to 1. So if you didn't get an answer, I hope that now makes sense. But if you did, very well done. So we're now going to move on and we're to look at single-celled organisms and the role diffusion plays in them. So single-celled organisms can use diffusion to transport molecules into their body from the air. This is because they have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio. So single-celled organisms with just one cell, they use diffusion to transport molecules into their body from the air around them. So transfer that in. And as I said, this is because they have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio, which you now should be able to calculate from our example just now. And due to their low metabolic demands, diffusion across this surface of the organism is sufficient enough to meet its needs. So diffusion here plays a very important role in keeping these single-celled organisms alive, because this is the process they use to get molecules into their bodies from the air around them. Obviously, multicellular organisms, this is different because they're made up of lots of different cells. In multicellular organisms, the surface area to volume ratio is small, so they cannot rely on diffusion alone. So instead, surfaces and organ systems have a number of adaptations that allows molecules to be transported into and out of cells. So these are adaptations which just make this sort of transportation process much easier for these multicellular organisms. And we're going to look at an example of this now. So the example here is diffusion in the gills of fish. Now you've probably seen these on fish before, but they're underneath the sorts of flaps that are in their face. You can't really see them from the diagram, but they are around this sort of area of the fish. Now, gills are where the gas exchange takes place in fish. And this is a really important area for fish as organisms, because the water which they're swimming in has the oxygen that they need to survive. So the water, which I said has the oxygen in, this passes through their mouth and over their gills. So the water goes through their mouth and it goes over these gills, which are, as I said, in the side of their head. And each gill has plates called gill filaments. And upon these are gill lamellae, which stick up. And this is where diffusion of oxygen into the blood and diffusion of carbon dioxide into the water takes place. Because these gill filaments and these gill lamellae, they create an increased surface area to volume ratio. So they're very thin and they stick out, which causes a big surface area for diffusion to take place. And the blood flows in one direction while the water flows in the other. So their bloodstream flows in the opposite direction to the water coming in through their mouth. And this just maintains that concentration gradient, which we spoke as being a factor before. So the two sort of adaptations on these gills are obviously the surface area to volume ratio is high in these little gill filaments and the gill lamellae, and also the blood flows in the opposite direction, which creates a constant steep concentration gradient for diffusion to be increased. As we spoke about before, this increases the rate of diffusion for these fish. And then another example is in plants, in particular in the roots of plants, because this is where the plants get a lot of their water and mineral ions. They get it from the soil around them, and this is taken in through the roots and drawn up through the plant. So roots have root hair cells, and similar to the gill lamellae, which we spoke about in the fish, these have a large surface area which project into the soil. And you can see from this diagram here that all of these roots are all spread out into the soil and they're very thin. So they have a high surface area to volume ratio, which means that rate of diffusion is going to be increased because there is a greater surface area. So there's more space for those molecules to move in into the cell. Now, we've finished the content for today's lesson, but we're just going to do a quick recap on what we have discussed. So we started off by talking about diffusion and what it is, and we spoke about the generally accepted definition being the spreading out of particles of any substance in a solution or particles in a gas, resulting in the net movement from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So that is the general definition for diffusion, but it's basically just the movement of particles from one area to another, depending on the concentration. We also discussed the factors that affect this rate, and we know that the concentration gradient, the temperature, and the surface area of the membrane all play a role in how slow or fast diffusion takes place. And we know that where all of these are greater, so where there's a higher concentration gradient, where the temperature is higher, and where the surface area of the membrane is higher, then there is an increased rate of diffusion for the reasons that we discussed earlier. We also looked at calculating a surface area to volume ratio. We did it with the cube in this instance, and we worked out that that is the volume compared to the surface area. And then we finished that by simplifying that ratio down into the smallest figures we can. And they've just finished now by looking at some examples in practice with fish and roots, and looking at how these organisms have developed special adaptations to increase the rate of diffusion so they can get all of those substances that they need into their respective cells and bodies. Now, I hope this video has proven useful. It's a real introductory video into the area of diffusion, and there is a lot more out there, especially in terms of examples and special adaptations that you can research up on. But I hope it's been useful, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.